This lesson is all about Isaac, his birth from Sarah, his being nearly sacrificed by Abraham, and his eventual marriage to Rebekah. So let's go to chapter 21, and this not interlinear, but parallel is using the NIV instead of the KJV. No real big difference as far as the purpose being to compare the Septuagint with the Masoretic text, all in English, but so just to let you know why that looks different. Chapter 121 begins with the birth of Isaac, whose name means laughter, which the text says is about people rejoicing with Sarah, but it also certainly is a reference to the fact that both Abraham and Sarah laughed at the prospect of having their own child in their own age. But one day, things tend to repeat. One day, the older son Ishmael was caught mocking Isaac just as Ishmael's mother had mocked Isaac's mother. So Sarah tells Abraham to get rid of him and his mother, and this time Abraham didn't want to do it, what Sarah wanted, but God told him to listen to her, which no self-respecting man, emphasis on self, would tolerate in today's Christianity. There's a lot of big push these days for men to have authority in a marriage, but that topic aside, this is something that God directed him to do, to listen to his wife. And the reason God gives is because of the need to reckon Abraham's offspring through Sarah's son, Isaac. Again, we see that not all of Abraham's natural children are heirs of the promise and covenant, which Paul confirms in Galatians 4:30. So Abraham sends them off with provisions, but when those run out, Hagar expects that they'll both die, she and her son, but God still shows mercy and still shows that he keeps his promises even to a slave woman. So he showed them where water was, and they stayed in the wilderness and settled there while Abraham settled in the land of the Philistines. And I don't think I scrolled this to the right place, but yeah, there we go. I was trying to catch up to where they send him away. But as a historical note, when the nation of Israel was eventually expelled from the land late in the 1st century AD by the Romans, they further humiliated the Jews by naming the land after their arch enemies, the Philistines, which in their language was pronounced Palestine. Now you know the origin of that word. There were no Palestinian nations or peoples. It was simply the area named after the enemies of their enemies to mock them. And the Philistines were not the original inhabitants of the land either. So by all rights, pretty much anybody who still has a lineage today is not a native of that land, the land of Canaan. They were all wiped out for a reason. And so that's what a Palestinian means. It's a Greek, or not Greek, Roman pejorative against Israel. So we read in the rest of the chapter how he sends them off and goes to a different place himself. And then in chapter 22 is where we see this incident that I had on the image that I started with, the incident of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. This is, of course, widely condemned by Bible critics, anti-theists, but God is testing Abraham's faith by telling him to sacrifice Isaac. But before we go over that, we need to clarify that Isaac was likely not a small child by this time. So let's look at this article, of course, linked in the description as always. This is Apologetics Press, and it goes into the question of how old Isaac was when Abraham was told to offer him. The Bible that says there does not give a direct answer, but we must conclude that neither our understanding of the passage or our grasp of the points that God wants us to learn, which I'll go over what I think of that, depend on knowing his age. So it's really irrelevant. But just to make the point that people bring this up, that they have this picture in their mind of Abraham sacrificing this child, that's probably not what happened. No one can say it did happen. And the linguistic data as they go on here shed some light on the matter, pointing us in the direction of Isaac being older than we normally think. That is to say, about at least 20 years old. So, in the first place, consider the details pertaining to chronology. Sarah gave birth to Isaac when she was 90. She would have been 92 or 93, maybe 95 when Isaac was weaned. She died at 127 when Isaac was 37 years old. Following Isaac's birth, the events of the rest of Genesis 21, let me skip the parentheses here, as well as the events of chapter 22, all occurred during a 35-year period. Notice the expression many days in Genesis 21:34, as well as the phrase after these things in 22:1. These allusions would suggest that some time had elapsed prior to the offering of Isaac. In the second place, the term lad, used to refer, that's the King James, to Isaac, is a flexible Hebrew term that does not necessarily refer to what we would ordinarily think of, that is to say, a boy, as we think of a boy. Rather, the term encompasses a wide range of meanings, anything from a baby to a young man. It can even refer to a servant or attendant who is full grown, as well as a soldier or even a leader. Looking at the context in 22:5, where the servants that accompanied Abraham and Isaac are referred to as young men. The word servants is precisely the same term that is used in verses 5 and 12 to refer to Isaac. Were the servants that accompanied Abraham 5 to 7-year-olds, or were they older? I think the answer is obvious. Their third point is that Isaac was given the task of carrying the wood for the impending sacrifice. There would have been enough wood to consume a human body when set on fire, so could a 5 to 7-year-old carry that? Again, no. Several commentators have weighed in on this question. Leopold wrote he may by this time have arrived at the age of some 18 to 20 years. Josephus stated Isaac was 25, and Clark, the commentator, it is more probable that he was now about 33. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown asserted that Isaac was then upwards of 20 years of age. A youth sufficient strength and agility to carry a load of firewood up a mountain, and a young man. So we can conclude, just skimming through that real quick, that as the several lines of evidence converge, they point to Isaac being a young man, not a young boy. So he was pretty much fully grown and entering his prime when this happened. So just to keep that in mind, especially when critics come around and say that, this was a child sacrifice, it was no such thing. So keeping in mind that Isaac is likely full grown by this time, let's go back to the text here, and we can see that God tells Abraham to take his dear son, the one he kept promising him, to go to a certain place and kill him in sacrifice. But while the text there doesn't tell us anything of what might have been going on in Abraham's head, we do have something in Hebrews 11:19, and the quote there is that Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. This is Abraham's deep faith, that God will keep his promises even if it means raising someone from the dead, in this case his very own son of promise. We do have a hint of that in verse 5 here, so let's scroll down to that, where Abraham is telling his servant, he has servants going with him to a certain point, and then he tells them to stay behind while he and his son go farther. And he tells the servants, wait here while we go off to worship, and then we will return to you. We will return to you. And I don't think he was just blowing them off. It seems to me that he was very confident that both of them would return one way or another. And let's not gloss over verse 8 here, where Abraham answers Isaac's question about needing an animal for the sacrifice. So Isaac didn't know, and Abraham didn't tell him. But Abraham answers his question with the reply that God himself will provide a sheep for the offering. This is clearly a prophetic reference to the eventual sacrifice of the Lamb of God, to which the later Passover feast would also point in more detail. Not only is this a test of Abraham's faith, it's also a type and shadow of the Messiah, just as we had the reference in Genesis 3 about the seed of the woman. That's the purpose of this incident, not to appease a bloodthirsty demigod who is ordering child sacrifice, as the critics say, but to illustrate Abraham's faith in the God who raises the dead. And it is no accident that a ram is caught in the thicket there to be the substitute. And also keep in mind that, as shown in verse 11, starting in verse 11 anyway, no actual sacrifice takes place of Isaac. God waited until the last second when he had his arm, Abraham had his arm raised to strike with the knife, but God stopped him. Abraham had passed the test by that point. There was no need to go farther. And this test, certainly God didn't need to know. God already knew, but there are always angels watching. And of course, people needed this as a lesson. The New Testament says that these things were recorded for us as lessons or examples. So there's more than one reason God does something, and he doesn't have to explain it all, and he doesn't intend to spoon feed us. But if you study the text carefully, you can put these things together and see what the big picture is here, and that is, this is a type and shadow of the eventual sacrifice of Jesus himself as a sacrificial lamb, and God did not order a human sacrifice to the point of completion. Even if he had, he would have raised the dead. But it did not happen, and that's the big point that we need to make sure the critics understand. No human sacrifice happened. And it's just important for the critics to admit that, that this was a type and shadow, that there's a reason for this whole thing. So we as humans, and even the angels, need something to see because we don't have the mind of God, neither do they. And this serves that purpose at the very least. And to make another quick side note, isn't this the essence of what the book of James is teaching? James doesn't say that someone is unsaved if they don't do certain good works, which the works salvationists can't agree on anyway, exactly what works those are that are required to be saved. Rather, he's saying, James, that is, that a hidden and inactive faith does no one any good. If God tested Abraham for the benefit of angels and people, then we too should demonstrate our faith and in tangible ways, not to become saved or to stay saved, but because we are saved. If we grasp the essence of the gospel, we will naturally want to act on it. So James is simply warning those who fail to act on it that they need to ask themselves if they're really saved. How can a saved person not act like it and not have any outward evidence that they are saved? That's all James is asking and exhorting people to do. And that's the example, yet another aspect of this illustration that God is making with Abraham. He wanted it demonstrated for whatever reason. Okay, now back to Genesis, starting in verse 13 here. Not only does God prevent the sacrifice of Isaac, he also provides the animal, a ram caught in a thicket, as I mentioned. And when God repeats his promise of making a great nation out of Abraham, he refers to Isaac as his only son, even though he also already had Ishmael. Ishmael was not considered his son as far as God was concerned. God also swears this by himself, so it can never depend on what anyone else would do or fail to do in the future. It is an unconditional, unilateral promise. But notice that, as we saw starting back here in verse 11, once again, God is described as the angel of the Lord. This is clearly a person, at least one, sometimes we see three, sometimes one, person of the Trinity, and likely the pre-incarnate Christ. And who would be better than him to provide the sacrificial sheep or lamb? The fact that the angel of the Lord is appearing here right after this incident is probably, and most likely, in my opinion, not a coincidence. He would be that sacrificial lamb. Now, the rest of the chapter lists the children born to Abraham's brother, so you can read through that after the promise and all that, and we'll go on to chapter 23, which is mostly about the death of Sarah. So she was 127, as it says there, and Abraham made arrangements to buy a plot of land. I think this is in Canaan, where she would be buried, and the person that had the land didn't even want to accept money from Abraham, but Abraham insisted. It was, I don't think, as much from the whole of Scripture, a pride issue as owing no one anything and not benefiting from someone else's gifts. This is something that was just a thing with him. So she was buried, and that's pretty much what chapter 23 is about. So let's go on to chapter 24. And this is the third part of the 3 points that I mentioned at the start with Isaac. We've already gone through the first 2. Now we're going to go into the issue of him finding a wife. So he didn't want Isaac to get a wife from the local Canaanite women, so he sends his servant to get one from his relatives. But she's not to be taken by force. If she or her family, per the social norms, refuses, then the servant is released from his oath to carry out Abraham's wishes. So the servant goes and asks God to help him identify the one, and the prayer was answered even before he finished it. So let me scroll down to that. This is where verse 8 is where God specifies that, I think it was God and not Abraham, specifying that she is not to be taken by force. And so off the servant goes, and then he gets there and prays to God for how he might identify this person. And there's in 15 is where it says that he hadn't even finished praying about it, and there she was. So he learns that this woman, Rebecca was her name, is among Abraham's relatives, and that he is then invited to spend the night among them. And her brother Laban will turn out to be a conniving man, as we'll find out in later chapters and lessons. But in verse 63, let's go down to there. This is mostly details about them, having food for their camels and all that sort of thing, and giving gifts to her, and going, him repeating the request of Abraham and how he met Rebecca and the whole story. He reiterates to them after they've taken him into their home and fed him supper. And eventually we will get to 63. It says that just as they're all on the way back, and one of the things I skipped over was the fact that they wanted her to stick around for like 10 days and wanted the servant to stay there and have a good time while, they had time to part with her. But he was in a hurry. He didn't want to make his master wait long. So but they left it up to her whether she was willing to go earlier, and she was. So off they went. And just as the whole caravan, or whatever you call it, the entourage, was reaching home, Isaac has gone out into the field at that moment to meditate. Now, some commentaries take the word to mean pray, but since verse 67, I just barely have on the screen here, tells us that his marriage to Rebecca comforts him after the death of his mother Sarah, the meaning may lean more toward him just processing his grief by walking alone in nature. That had not happened that long ago. The idea that this meditation anywhere in Scripture has any resemblance to the heathen practices of silencing the mind or opening chakras is just utter nonsense. The Bible's meditation is always filling the mind, not emptying it, and with reasoned and normal rational thoughts. It has nothing to do with the Hindu mainly practice of doing the exact opposite and throwing reason out the window to get your mind out of the way, which is, of course, a dangerous practice, as even some of the people who have practiced it will tell you, if you're not grounded and this and that things can go wrong. Well, that's nothing to do with the Bible. The Bible, especially in the Psalms, about meditating on God's law, is the point is the object of meditation, not the method or anything. It's still just thinking and focusing, but it's on the truths and attributes of God, not on some mystical, ethereal force or something within you. So, and that's pretty much all I have to say about those few chapters. It's a good place to stop, because in the next chapter we'll find out about the children from this marriage, and they will turn out to be two battling, warring bloodlines that, again, go on to this day. This is, again, why the study of these things is important, because it helps you understand why the Middle East is always such a quagmire. There's a thousand other reasons people would give, but this has been going on for thousands of years, and we're not going to stop it ourselves. It's a supernatural thing, and it will be not only have we seen this already with Isaac and Ishmael, but we will see it again with the twin sons to be born from Isaac and Rebekah here. So again, the line will split, and not all the children of Isaac and Rebekah, these twins, for crying out loud, one will be chosen and the other not. And so again, God makes distinctions. This time it won't be just on the mother, but on the boys themselves and the kind of people they would turn out to be. And this is not Calvinism either. This is not some kind of fate. It's just God knowing what kind of people he's dealing with. And as we will see, and hopefully you've already been noticing as we go along, not so much a lot in Genesis, but with Cain and Abel even, it's the younger that turned out to be the righteous one. And so it was with Abraham's two sons, and so it will be with Isaac's two sons. And throughout the Old Testament, God is always picking the younger, the weaker, the smaller, the least esteemed. That's how God does things, and that's one of the ways people can be sure that it's God's doing and not anyone else's. He defies social norms all the time. So when God intervenes, he doesn't care what our habits are or our traditions are. He will do what he'll do for his own reasons, and we have to be careful about adhering too much to traditions, especially as Christians in this, what we call the church age or the age of grace, which is that what you see in the New Testament is nothing like church history has been. God works through and around people. We've seen that already. But it wasn't what he had preferred. But we are allowed free will, and this, again, against Calvinism, does not impinge on God's sovereignty or his honor. God being sovereign and also being righteous allows us to have free will and to go away from him if we so choose, because he's not a tyrant. So to just kind of summarize what we've gone over in this lesson in chapters 21 to 24, this was all about Isaac being the child of promise, not Ishmael, and that it was important that he was born from Sarah, not from Hagar, the slave girl. And then the second point was the sacrifice. And let me go put that picture back up. Of course, this is, I don't know when this artwork was done, but angels in the Bible do not have wings except for the cherubim who surround the throne of God, and they have more than two. But, and it's the angel of the Lord, which again is probably God himself. And there's the ram in the thicket, and this is almost, maybe the younger end of the range of possible ages for Isaac, but he's being stopped. He's got the knife in his hand. He's about to strike, but God prevents it. It does not happen. So, and then of course the third point again was the marriage to Rebekah and how God intervened and chose her basically, and made sure that that there was no mistake about it, and she came from the right family and so forth. So we're going on to the second generation of those chosen people, and chosen for reasons that no human would decide or make up. So again, we have just the details after details in these accounts telling us that this is not something the Hebrews made up to make themselves look better. It doesn't work that way. And we've seen, that the Bible does not whitewash anyone. Abraham tried to pass off Sarah as his sister to save his own skin, and so forth. So we're going to see, we also saw about Lot and some issues there. So this is going to continue. We'll see that with the two twin boys, Jacob and Esau. And so tune into the next lesson.